Now being recorded.
Okay, Todd, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, this is Todd Rasmussen at the University of Georgia. I'd like to welcome you to the final Cyberseminar at Quasi for the spring quarter. The presentation this time is on the Christina River Basin CZO. These critical zone observatories are the theme of this year's presentations. And this one is being given by Anthony Aufdenkampe of the Stroud Water Research Center. The title of his talk is The Spatial and Temporal Integration of Carbon and Mineral Fluxes, a whole watershed approach to quantifying anthropogenic modification of critical zone carbon sequestration. Anthony is at the Stroud Water Research Center, but he's also a adjunct assistant professor at the University of Delaware. He's also the principal investigator of the Organic and Isotope Geochemistry Group. His background is from the University of Washington in chemical oceanography as well as chemistry from Dartmouth College. And I'm pleased to welcome Anthony as our presenter today.
Great. Thank you very much for having me and all of you for attending. All right. Great. Well, that was a nice introduction. I'm, as you can see here, listed one of the co-PIs on the Christina River Basin CZO project. Don Sparks is the lead PI who kind of oversees the whole project, and I've taken kind of the role as co-lead PI because of the fact that my science kind of is integrative across multiple disciplines. So I kind of am the integrator-in-chief of the science at some level. So that's why I'm on the phone today. Todd asked me to introduce the Stroud Water Research Center. So the critical zone, the Christina River Basin CZO is a nearly equal partnership between the University of Delaware and the Stroud Water Research Center. The Stroud Water Research Center is a nonprofit, independent, basic research center that used to be a field station for the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, which is the oldest natural history museum in the country, and the home of Ruth Patrick, who many of you may know is one of the grandmothers of aquatic ecology, and she helped found the Stroud Water Research Center. In 1999, it became independent. We exist on the banks of White Clay Creek and right in the middle of our CZO, which we've been studying for 45 years now. So we get we're a team of people from different backgrounds, all focused on studying streams and rivers, and in a multidisciplinary way. So the whole CZO concept really fit with us, but we didn't have as strong of a geo background as we really needed, and that's why the partnership with the University of Delaware really works out. And they're on the other end of the CZO. We're in the Piedmont, and the Christina River Basin extends into the coastal plain. So as for all the CZOs, there's a large group of people that's involved to really bring together and fulfill the vision that critical zone observatories were a place for facilitating really multidisciplinary science by bringing together teams of people. So this is a list of people, a lot from the University of Delaware and Stroud Water Research Center, but also from elsewhere. We also have quite a number of collaborators who aren't directly named or involved in our CZO, but either have projects that overlap with the CZO. And this list is growing rapidly. So these are people we talk to and share data with, et cetera. So let me give a little bit of a context of where the critical zone, the Christina River Basin is. It's this watershed right here that basically extends from the Piedmont in southeastern Pennsylvania into the coastal plain of northern Delaware. So 3/4 of it is in Piedmont, and 1/4 of it's in coastal plain. It is exceptionally well studied. It actually feeds the drinking water to nearly 1 million people. More than half of the state of Delaware gets its water from the Christina River Basin. and also a large part of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is just on the other side. They get their drinking water from an adjacent watershed. I forgot to mention that actually Maryland has a little bit of our watershed in it. The Christina River Basin is actually most well known for its work on the Brandywine Creek and White Clay Creek. Brandywine Creek is the largest tributary. The reason it's named the Christina is kind of just due to the fact that the Christina River is entirely tidal. So the early explorers in this region, Delaware is the first state, so early explorers were here very early. Basically followed the Christina River. It was the widest of the rivers, and so they thought that that must have been the biggest, but it turns out it's the smallest. It's very well studied in by the USGS initially. A lot of the early work by Luna Leopold and Reds Woolman on how streams meander was all done in Brandywine Creek, and of course the Stroud Water Research Center has been working intensively, and Ruth Patrick before the Stroud Center was founded. Unlike the other CZOs, we have a very substantial history of human land use and impacts. Here you see the land use. We have quite a bit of urban and industrial in the southern part of the watershed, right where the Piedmont cuts through a schist and nice ridge into the Costa Plain is where there was a lot of hydropower for early industry. DuPont Corporation is located right in that region, and therefore early industry was there. And then in addition to agriculture, the main Route 1 that connected Philadelphia to Baltimore and to the south runs right through the middle of our watershed, and it's just a few miles from the Stroud Center. So old history. So we embraced that rather than running away from it, as you'll see in a moment. It also has a diverse metasedimentary lithology that's quite complex. I guess you can't really read those rock types, but you can see that there are a lot of them. So we took all of this and, like I said, embraced the human aspect and started thinking about the main hypothesis that our observatory would be well poised to answer, and we came up with this overall hypothesis that the processes that mix minerals and carbon are rate limiting to watershed scale chemical weathering, soil production, and carbon sequestration. It's basically the result of some work of a number of us that showed that those processes of the water cycle, the mineral cycle, and the carbon cycle really can't be completely understood in isolation, that there has to be an integration of understanding of those three processes. And specifically for carbon sequestration in the landscape, as you'll see in a moment, we believe that integrating those processes is absolutely fundamental. And we continue that with the fact that humans clearly are accelerating rates of carbon mineral mixing, primarily via erosion and subsequent deposition, but also via plowing and other activities. And that would then result in net anthropogenic carbon sequestration that could be significant to local, regional, or even global budgets. We're not the first to really explore this idea that when humans move around massive amounts of earth and mix it in the landscape, where that material then deposits, it tends to deposit with carbon. So there have actually been a number of papers that have explored this over time. I'm going to hold on to that thought for a while to kind of think about what we're doing relative to this other work. So based on this idea that erosion must result in burial, and where there's mineral burial, there tends to also be carbon burial. But where there's mineral erosion, there's not necessarily there's not really necessarily carbon that's embedded with those minerals or buried. The carbon that's eroded into streams and rivers is typically in active zones that will recycle and return to the atmosphere relatively rapidly. So the goal, or kind of a list of tasks that we have ahead in front of us were then to integrate the feedbacks between the water, mineral, and carbon cycles, and to do that over contrasting land uses, and to consider not just what's going on below one's feet. You know, if you're an agricultural soil scientist, you know, you can look at the field scale, but often that ignores where materials are ultimately transported to. So these geophysical boundaries, you know, often separate fields. And so we call ourselves kind of the Saprolites to Sea project. We're looking at minerals as they basically get transformed from bedrock through all these different environments to where they ultimately get deposited at longer time scales. So at the core of this hypothesis, it's actually illustrated in this figure, which I haven't quite explained, is that there's been a number of studies that have shown that one of the most important factors for stabilizing organic carbon is, in fact, its association and stabilization by minerals. And yet there are numerous studies that are showing that there's, you know, massive amounts of primary production. What's going on? All this, all the numbers that we're kicking around in terms of global warming are all net numbers, right? So the fluxes, the natural fluxes in and out of the biosphere are 2 orders of magnitude higher than the differences that we care about relative to global warming. So clearly, most primary production is in excess of what can be stabilized, and meanwhile, there is, you know, when minerals get produced or mineral surface area gets produced, in the saprolite, if it never comes in contact with mineral or with carbon, then there's really no potential for it to stabilize that carbon. So it's this mixing process that can basically take carbon and minerals and basically one stabilizes the other. And it flips the other way around, that in the absence of carbon and the carbon dioxide that's produced when the carbon is metabolized, you don't get the same intensity of mineral weathering. So back to these other studies. As I mentioned, there have been a number of other studies. There was actually a debate in Science that was kicked off by the Van Oost paper in 2007 that really debated, you know, is erosion resulting in net carbon sequestration on a landscape? Bob Stallard said that there was a big one. Ratan Lal said, no, there's not. Van Oost said, well, there's a mild one. But each of them, if you look at it on a landscape, and I should just throw this whole thing in here. Oh, I don't have the key. My apologies. So the key is missing here. This first column is basically what you'd consider a subsoil, and then you have a topsoil, and then a colluvial deposit, and then down here is the estuary deposit. Let's see, my pointer is, I have to grab the green one. Down here is kind of the ultimate location where things get buried. I apologize if somehow the text got cut off. But really the natural process moves material and has it basically get stored either temporarily or for long periods of time at ultimately numerous locations. And the mineral, which is represented by the circle, and the carbon that is tightly associated with that mineral, represented by the brown fill in the center of the circle, and then the loosely kind of co-buried material, which is the lighter brown around the perimeter, you know, associates or disassociates depending on the process of burial or erosion or re-erosion or resuspension, and it's really quite a bit more complex. So most of these previous studies never really looked over the whole landscape. They were really looking at a very narrow slice or perspective. So our CZO is explicitly trying to look at the complexities of both the natural system and the increased complexities by adding humans to the system, or at least the increased number of possibilities. Let's see, how can I advance now? So our CZO is organized around objectives that really look at these processes at multiple scales, and we kind of think of it as going from small scale to large scale and also from upstream to downstream. So our first objective looks at some of the key remaining questions about how these organo-mineral interactions actually stabilize carbon and how they might change mineral weathering when you have associations. We want to now integrate that over plot scale or hill slope scale processes by understanding the water and solute fluxes, the soil production, upland erosion, colluvial deposition, etc. We want to integrate that soil production into the whole lateral mineral conveyor belt. I guess I got ahead of myself a bit, which kind of includes the erosion deposition, not just on the hill slope, but into the alluvial system and the cycling on and off the floodplains. And then lastly, to really achieve the synthesis, the ultimate goal, we need to do some serious integration across all of these scales. So the Christina River Basin is relatively large compared to some of the other CZOs. We can't study all of it, even though we need to consider all of it. So we have selected some more intensive study sites, the first of which is, and they're situated across the basin as I show you here. The first of which is the third order headwaters, eastern headwaters of White Clay Creek. They're right behind the Stroud Water Research Center, which is shown in, let's see, where's my little green pointer? Oh yeah, there it is, which is shown right down here. And it's 750 hectares and is mixed agriculture and forest. It was actually selected because it has a very healthy, old, and wide riparian forest over much of the watershed. But the headlands or the uplands are all in agriculture. This is a LiDAR image of the lower part of that. We have some intensive study transects across hill slopes, A, B, C, et cetera. We got them lettered. You can see in this LiDAR, which you've probably heard about because all of the CZOs received 2 passes of NCOM flown LiDAR during the winter and summer of 2010. These LiDAR data products are absolutely exceptional. They gave a specification of 9 laser hits per square meter and a vertical accuracy of 10 centimeters, which they exceeded massively. They got somewhere between 10 and 20 laser hits per square meter versus, you know, the half a hit or the 1 hit per meter and a half, which is typical in kind of more commercial products. So they were easily an order of magnitude higher density than what's commercially available. And the vertical accuracy was 2 centimeters. So we can see all sorts of amazing things in here, including if you look in these agricultural places, you can actually see the tire tracks from the tractors that drive across it. You can see trails underneath the forest canopy, deer trails. It's really stunning. So one of the beauties about this watershed is that we actually know the land use quite well, and we actually have a chronosequence, which I'm flipping through right now, of these polygons that I have here are different woodlots that came into, basically were replanted and started growing at different times. So I'm going to go backwards here. This is one that was completely bare. I got to grab the green arrow again. That was completely bare in 1937, and by 1957, in this image, it's already beginning to forest out. And each one of these polygons, in turn, basically fills out over time. So we also have a chronosequence of the reestablishment of forest on these landscapes. So we've been here for quite a while. It's right in our backyard. It gives us the opportunity to do studies really quite intensely. You know, we can be outside. This is a small watershed. An hour after an intensive rain is when the maximum flooding happens, and we can be out there in numbers during something like Hurricane Irene or such as you see in this photo, and really do some intensive measurements, which is really quite exceptional. We also have ag, and I'm going to talk a little bit about more about what we're trying to do in those ag fields. But this is an example of us instrumenting soil moisture probes underneath an ag field. These are going to be there permanently. We've figured out how to basically run conduit below the plow layer and basically collect sensor data underneath ag. So these are some of the examples of what we're doing right here behind the Stroud Water Research Center. We wanted to get end members of land use, and to do that, we needed a watershed that was under 100% forest and had been for quite a while, and that was a really tough task. We spent hours and hours, each of us, looking on Google Earth images for a watershed that might be 100% forested. We were looking for a perennial stream under 100% forest, and we found one. And it turns out it's managed by the local land conservancy, the Brandywine Conservancy, and we have, in fact, historical data on that stream, which is kind of amazing. It just turned out. So we are setting that up as our 100% forested end member, and it's really quite exceptional. Already, we've noticed a stunning result. During Hurricane Irene and then a week later during Tropical Storm Lee, each of those storms dropped 6 inches of rain on our watershed. For Lee, 2 inches fell in about a half hour, and the whole watershed was completely soaked before any drop of Lee fell. So that was actually the biggest storm in the area. The gauge, we have a pressure transducer right where Steve's hand is, right above that culvert, and the stream level came up by about an inch. We had an ISCO sampler there all set up to capture the storm. We had never had a storm sample from this before. And the water never went above the inlet to that sampler, so we collected a bunch of empty bottles, a bunch of air. And you can see the evidence of that. You can see some erosion right at the very edges of where the water currently is flowing, but not up here in the ferns. So that was not an equipment malfunction. So the question is it due to the vegetation? Is this what old forests in the East Coast used to look like, or is it some geological anomaly? And in fact, what I don't have pictures of are we had about 30 people from the local Society for Exploration Geophysics, the local chapter out of Rutgers University, along with some folks from Temple, came out here in force with all their students and graduate students, and did some massive amount of surveying recently to really try and get at this question. Is there something going on, some fracture network or some interesting high permeability layer that might cause some interbasin transfer? We have found a watershed that's nearly 100% under row crop ag, and it's actually a second-order stream. It's very close to us. It's also under a conservation easement to be in ag for perpetuity, and we have full permissions to gauge it and permissions to basically start putting sensors on it, although we haven't really quite gotten there yet. It's on a really similar lithology to the Stroud Water Research Center, so that's another bonus. We also wanted a site that kind of represented the extreme of human land use. What happens, like what I showed in that picture earlier, what happens when there's a massive construction project going on? What happens when you move just insane amounts of earth to create a parking lot? Despite the best measures, we know that a lot of suspended sediment, fine material, gets into the stream. So we were looking for something like that. And what we stumbled upon happened to be right across the street from this ag site. It seems a little odd at first, but we found a landfill. And it's the Southern Chester County landfill. It's the biggest one around. They're in the business of, they do a very good job of collecting all the water that leaches through the landfill and then recycling it. Actually, they turn it into methane gas and then power. And then they pour it back on the landfill. So it's not a pollution issue, but the local laws require that they bury the garbage daily with soil, and then they need to create space for it. So they're constantly, this is another view of it, they're constantly in the business of digging a lot of dirt around and basically excavating 20-foot deep soil pits for us. On the same lithology that the ag site is on and on the same lithology that the Stroud Center is on. So, so even though they have some really good sediment retention basins, we get big storms and material goes through their system, and the stream downstream of them is just loaded with sediment, with fine suspended sediment. The evidence is everywhere, despite their best measures. So, so we're interested in seeing how that contrasts. What happens when you have just massive amounts of sediment entering the system? to integrate all these processes, we really need to go downstream, and we talk about that quite a bit. Down near the mouth of White Clay Creek, where's my green pointer? We have a couple of sites which are of interest. We have, first of all, a USGS gauging station, which also allows us to measure suspended sediment fluxes out of the entire White Clay Creek Basin, where all these other sites are located. Well, with the exception of the Foresight, but it's actually it's in the Brandywine, and also it also gets into a tidal freshwater river before it enters. Well, even out here, we're freshwater in the Delaware River. That's a lot of interest, actually. The National Science Foundation explicitly wanted us, even though it wasn't part of our proposal, they are encouraging us to really think more and more coastally. So in our renewal, we will almost certainly really begin to emphasize the coastal work, and we're already beginning to emphasize it. We've created, since we got funded, we've kind of created some satellite sites to try and leverage other activities that are related, that are happening locally, that also get us more and more coastal. One of them is that there's a seventh site that is just spitting distance from the Christina River Basin on the same lithology as everywhere else, but it's in Maryland and it drains to the Chesapeake, where some researchers at the University of Delaware, which is right here in Newark, Delaware. Whoops, I got to grab the pointer again. Right here in Newark, Delaware. There's been a long-term study and a lot of effort. This is like 5-10 minutes away from the university, so a lot of people are doing work there. So we wanted to wrap them into the fold, integrate their data, which is hydrological data, soil science, forest ecology, ecohydrology kind of stuff. Down near the coast, there's a project at Indian River Bay looking at subterranean groundwater discharge into the estuary, and specifically looking at nutrient fluxes and redox conditions and the biogeochemistry of denitrification, which is related to what we're interested in, which is, well, I'll touch on this a little bit later, but the redox chemistry in shallow near-stream groundwater can massively affect how minerals are actually being transported and carbon being transported into the stream system. So we made a connection there. There are, as we want to go further and further downstream to really look at the ultimate deposition and fate of the material that's being exported from these small watersheds, we really need to get into the estuary. And so there's we have some collaborations with Chris Summerfield and David Valinsky and others who have been doing coring and other work in some of these depot centers, and also myself and other colleagues have been working in salt marshes looking at nutrient cycles. So we're kind of wrapping those into the fold. And we're, of course, paying attention to the work that's being done at the mouths of some of these other rivers, because if we ultimately want to understand what's happening in the estuary, we need to understand the entire Delaware estuary, frankly, at least what the fingerprints of their sediments look like. One of the aspects of having a CZO is to develop infrastructure to support not only our own research, but to encourage the vision of the National Science Foundation that each CZO become kind of a nexus or a facility, an observatory that is open to the entire geoscience community, nationally and even internationally. So we have the resources and are putting an effort into oh, look at that. How did I miss that? All right. So I had some images of some of the things we're doing, but you can read that we're putting in flumes. We've had a lot of wells and lysimeters, but we're putting them in strategic locations. We're digging soil pits. You saw some pictures of that, and we're creating sampling infrastructure so that there's the future ability to collect the highest quality samples from these various environments, and also sensing infrastructure, which I'm about to talk about. So, part of the vision of, again, of the CZOs is not just multidisciplinary teams, but actually to be able to increase the level of investment in infrastructure so that our ability to make measurements can catch up with our ability to simulate what's happening, or our theoretical understanding of what might be happening in the watershed. We need to be able to observe it. And the challenges there are the fact that the critical zone, the Earth's surface, versus coverage, right? So this is kind of a typical approach that a lot of us are used to of, getting a sensing network in place. Requires us putting an investment into a data logger, in many cases a multiplexer so you can handle more than just a few sensors. And then if you want the data to be streaming or live, you need to add a radio. And without even plugging in a sensor, we're talking about a base cost of $2,500 per sensing node, per sensing station, or whatever you want to call it. So we were really trying to think about, well, how can we do what we need to do when, even with the investment NSF made in the CZOs, we can't do that kind of thing at many locations, especially because you add the sensors and that increases, the cost goes up from there. So so we started realizing, actually I read an article in Wired magazine that talked about the future of open source hardware. And we started looking into it. And it turns out that there is a movement to build open source electronics hardware, and actually other kind of hardware, that is exploding due to the capabilities of micromanufacturing, the ability to print a circuit board literally from something that looks like a printer. And you can print circuit boards, custom circuit boards. You can print 10 of them at a per unit cost of $10 each. They are unbelievably inexpensive. You send someone a CAD image of the circuit board you want, and you get it back. Of course, not everyone knows how to design a circuit board, but there's a community of people who are now sharing these plans with open source electronics CAD software. You can share the plans, and using the same concepts of the open source software movement, everything that's been developed there translates beautifully to open source electronics. Leading the pack is the Arduino electronics platform. You can now buy these in Radio Shack. They are everywhere. There's over 500,000 users, and it's expanding. And because it's open source, anybody can manufacture them, anybody can tweak them, and it's just exploding. So we can basically get a microprocessor and data logger for $42, buy a number of other open source electronics, and other really inexpensive commoditized equipment, attach it to an open source radio using the Zigbee open source protocol, and voila, for something like less than $100 or more than $100 depending on radios and the number of sensors you want, et cetera, you can, I would almost say, exceed the capabilities of the Campbell data logger, because this is actually a lot more flexible than the Campbell data logger, and you're going to see some examples coming up in a moment. So at that kind of cost, that means we can really handle more spatial coverage, but we can still attach to this open source data logging and data communication equipment. We can attach the highest quality sensors, the OEM sensors, right? A decagon soil moisture probe, and then it turns out, YSI or some of these other companies, they don't make all their own sensors. They actually buy them from other manufacturers, and then they add the data logging package, their customized software, and they package it all up, mark up the price. And in fact, most of the markup happens with the addition of the data logger and their software to communicate with it all. So, so for example, Solnest pressure transducer, a really high quality pressure transducer, is $1,500 or so. Yet the equally high quality pressure transducer that just has 2 wires coming out of the back of it can cost only $600. So you have high quality sensors at low cost attached to extremely low cost data communication equipment, and you can really start making things happen. There are some sensors that we're using and that all of us need to use that don't quite fit into the category I just described. We're playing around with some in situ submersible UV-vis spectrophotometers made by a company called SCAN. They're from Europe. S-Atlantic makes the Suna and the ISIS equipment. They were primarily designed for marine applications, but they're finding their way into rivers now that do similar things. Essentially, from this UV vis, we can get not only this one's full spectrum, so actually we can because it goes into the visible, you can get a turbidity, or actually because it's really full spectrum, you can actually calibrate it to something that more closely approximate total suspended solids. That's a typo, not by me, but by them. So you can get turbidity, total suspended solids, but what the really interesting thing is are parameters like nitrate and dissolved organic carbon that are not so easy to measure. So these spectra are turbidity compensated or corrected and deconvoluted with multivariate statistics, partial least squares regression, to actually come up with some really robust numbers. So from that, we're getting high resolution data that looks like this. We have some measurements. There's usually some type of offset. You can see that offset here. Here's dissolved organic carbon with the measurements of the points, and then we have two different sensors. One, they drift a little bit. Depends on. These are actually two different sensors. They both. This is where we did a little drift correction. You can see that one sensor is drifting more than another. It has to do with the chemistry of the window. I'm not going to get into that. But once you work up that data, you actually get pretty reasonable calibrations with the offset. So with all this data that we are developing, we really need to develop a system to bring all that data together, make it visible, make it useful. And of course, all of us know that there are lots of agencies, lots of people bringing data together. And the beauty is that Quasi has already made huge strides at organizing hydrological data. The Quasi Hydro Server is really exceptional, and we are building basically a client for the Hydro Server. And I am a little bit overstating that we're building it. We're partnering with the University of Washington's Applied Physics Laboratory, and in fact, my partner, Emilio Mayorga, is on the line right now listening in, I noticed. So he was actually doing this for a coastal project funded by NOAA, and I asked him, I said, well, gee, could you adapt your visualization system to basically take advantage of Quasi's Water One Flow Web Services to ingest data, and then all we have to do is feed all of our data from our own sensors and our partner sensors into Quasi Hydro Server, and then we should be able to visualize it using your system, right? And he was like, yeah. And so that's what we have. We have a prototype right now that's doing that. And in fact, this URL is no longer the right one. We have it linked to from our CZO website, and it's basically a really nice data viewer. So. And it is using both USGS data, NOAA data, the local Delaware environmental observation system data, and then our CZO data is beginning to arrive there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about I've been giving you the background, kind of the infrastructure that we're building, where we're doing our research. I gave you a little bit of the context of the overriding objectives or questions or that we're using to integrate our research. We've tried our best to organize our research around these questions rather than around disciplines. And I think it's initially proved to be quite challenging, but I'm beginning to see that the effort has paid off. I'm going to talk a little bit about these objectives one by one. The first one is really looking at these carbon mineral complexes. What we have here is mineral surface area, which is plotted on the x-axis, and weight percent organic carbon of a sediment or soil, and that label is missing. I apologize. And the idea is, and this was an idea that was really first appreciated by the coastal marine community, that there is a sweet spot where if you look at coastal marine sediments, and their organic carbon contents are highly correlated to the mineral surface area. And for a very long time, down core variation in weight percent carbon in a marine core was either debated as evidence for changes in bottom water anoxia or surface water planktonic productivity. But then Rick Kyle and Larry Mayer kind of simultaneously started measuring mineral surface area, and they found that when you normalize the mineral surface area, all that variability disappears. That basically there are these constant relationships at a given location that fall right along a perfect line with an intercept of 0 between mineral surface area and organic carbon. So what that says is that you know, within the critical zone, you can actually create mineral surface area via chemical weathering, and that mineral surface area might be far outside of the contact of organic carbon. Meanwhile, most organic carbon is produced in zones where there are no minerals. So in the absence of any kind of mixing process, almost all that carbon would get respired down to quantities that were, you know, essentially negligible. But in the presence of physical mixing, where you mix the carbon with minerals, if you get anywhere near a ratio that is along this band here, that material is going to be highly stabilized and not likely to return to the atmosphere. So you can, when you extrapolate that over a watershed, you get data like this. This data is actually not from our CZO. We're just beginning to accumulate these data sets. In fact, I was looking at plots of this morning. But this is from South America, Bolivia specifically, the Andean Amazon. And we see that basically material that's entering the rivers, these landslides and road cuts, have almost no carbon on them relative to the surface area. Yet all the material that's in suspension in the Amazon has a lot of carbon associated with those minerals. And then when you look at the deposits in the floodplains, there are some deposits where that occur after really heavy erosion events, and they don't have a lot of carbon on them. But the vast majority of deposits are completely loaded with carbon. So that's kind of the basis of our hypothesis, and we're seeing basically the same thing. But really, one of the questions that we have, I guess back to this first slide, is we have a hypothesis based on some other data that suggests that we're not, this isn't just some straight line that is constant, but rather the ratio of carbon to mineral surface area is reflects the stability. So if you have material that has a really large amount of carbon relative to the protection offered by the minerals, it's less stable. If you have a lot of mineral surface area, then you have a lot more capacity to stabilize minerals. So we're actually running a series of experiments where we're looking at how we're all starting with the same organic matter. We're doing we're looking at the role of iron. We're looking at differences in microbiology of the soil community, but primarily we're varying the ratio of minerals to carbon, and then looking at how much respiration happens, how much of that carbon then gets tightly bound to the minerals versus remaining free. These get mixed in such a way that the organic matter should be is all larger than 250 microns. The minerals are all less than 250 microns. So a simple wet sieving can kind of tell us whether or not the material is degraded, and then we can do a density fractionation to really confirm that carbon is tightly bound to the minerals. This is an application of that open source electronics platform. This is basically an automated soil respiration system. Right, this is the early version of the system. Right now, we've expanded to 60 jars where we're incubating soils, and we have a LiDAR analyzer around here. In this black box is $40 worth of open source electronics that controls all 120 solenoids, where a jar is mostly getting a stream of filtered atmosphere, and then for 5 minutes out of 4 hours, basically it switches in a recirculation loop through the LiDAR, and during those 5 minutes we can measure a rate of change of the CO2 inside there and get a respiration rate. and we can basically return to the same jar it's every 6 hours, so it's 4 times per day, and get continuous rates. And now this experiment's been going on for 120 days, and we're seeing really interesting differences between the treatments. So our second objective is really about kind of looking toward the hill slope, both water fluxes and then the process of soil production. One of the things that we're using to really look at how minerals are being produced and then mixed up into the upper soil and then potentially eroded are meteoric radioisotopes such as lead-210, cesium-137, beryllium-7, and actually beryllium-10 for really long-term stuff. This allows us, the differences between the profiles allows us to tell a lot about mixing. In short, all of these meteoric isotopes come down in rainfall. They're all highly surface reactive, so they adsorb onto the surface of the minerals right at the top of the soil. And the only way that they get down deep, such as in this profile here, this is a forest soil. You can see a lot of lead-210 in the surface and very little below 5 centimeters. But in this ag soil, there's a lot of lead-210 down deep, and the only reason it can get down there is by physical mixing. And so we can look at these differences in different environments. The inventory in a steady-state environment is basically comes into equilibrium between the rain rate and the decay rate. And so that inventory also tells you what the total net erosion or deposition has been and at that location over the time scale of the half-life of the radioisotope. So that's really useful because we have enough radioisotopes that we can look at really short annual time scales all the way out to basically comparisons between pre-European and post-European settlement. A lot of it hinges on finding references, and luckily in our landscape, there's a history of preserving oak trees, white oak trees, that basically marked property boundaries. They used them as property boundary markers, like this one. Several of them in our area are actually certified pen oaks. That's not a species. It's a white oak tree that was certified to have been standing during the time when William Penn first came to Pennsylvania. So these are at least 300 or 400-year-old trees, probably quite a bit older. So we can go basically right near their base and do a core, and we know there hasn't been any plowing or roads or construction there of any sort over history, and then get our references for our isotopes. So, we're looking at water movement in these landscapes. This is another application. This is a kind of standard application. This is of our open source network. We basically have a data logger in here connected to a pressure transducer. We have, I think, something like 2 or 3 dozen of these in one highly studied floodplain and hill slope area, what we call Transect A. We can connect to these also redox sensors and soil moisture sensors. We're looking at how episodic events of either stream flooding or rainfall are changing both the water flows, which we can calculate from the pressure gradients between the pressure sensors in these different layers of the floodplain, and how that's correlated to different redox changes in chemistry. We're specifically interested in this for our hypothesis because we'd initially entered thinking that mineral surface area was conservative, and therefore we could use it as kind of the grand normalizer for carbon. But we've since discovered that about a third of the mineral surface area in our watershed is related to iron oxides, and of course they're redox sensitive. So iron oxides are being dissolved and precipitated all over our riparian area, and we need to track that. And some of the hottest data off the press, and I'm really excited about this, shows that actually when iron oxides are co-precipitated with organic matter, they sequester up to 2 times more organic matter per meter squared of surface area and per gram of iron oxide. So having that precipitation happen in something like a wetland really leads toward a very high carbon sequestration. I know I'm running a little low on time, and I am getting close to the end here. We're looking at how this works over the landscape. We're doing that by looking at suspended sediment sources. We essentially want to use different approaches to fingerprinting along the lines of what Des Walling innovated in the last latter half of his career over the last 20 so years or so, to basically identify whether or not suspended sediments came from upper soil horizons, locations where they were likely to have had carbon associated with them before they eroded, versus the kind of source that would be basically a ditch or a gully or a road bank where the material almost certainly had no carbon attached to it. And we're hoping that we can do this both for the modern time and for the historical, although there are challenges there. We have quite a team of people working on it. To do these kind of isotopes, the lead-210, et cetera, beryllium-7, beryllium-10, on suspended sediments is a trick because gamma counting requires tens of grams of material. So you can't really do that with an ISCO, which is shown in the foreground of this picture. I think you can rig these up to, out of the box, you can configure them to handle 2 liters of water per sample at the most. So what we did is that in this little toolbox over here, we have one of our open source electronics attached to a cell phone, a really cheap minute-by-minute plan cell phone from Walmart. We can essentially dial this thing remotely from anywhere and have it trigger a pump that's in the stream and fill this barrel anytime we want. And because we have some live sensor data from the pressure transducer that's down here that's also connected to electronics, inexpensive electronics in that box, we basically can trigger that filling of that barrel the moment the hydrograph starts to decline. It's really quite exciting, and we have this set up now at multiple locations. And at our main location, we actually have 4 of these in series. So we can begin to look at the whole hydrograph. This is a little bit of an example of what we're beginning to do with our exceptional LiDAR data set to look at sediment volumes. This is a 1 meter DEM of a little bend in our stream that we extrapolated from our LiDAR. But because our LiDAR is so exceptional, we can easily turn that into a 1/2 meter DEM, which I'm showing now, or even we now have a 1/4 meter DEM. We can look at this, we can then, on any portion of our landscape, basically extract an elevational transect. We don't need to go out there with surveying equipment, well, except for when we want to go underneath the water. Unfortunately, this wasn't a green laser, so we can't look under the water. But everywhere else, we have exceptional data to begin to answer this question about sediment volumes. This is a tin directly from the point cloud. You can kind of see how much detail is in there, 15-centimeter contours from the point cloud, et cetera. One of the things that we're exploring is also, back to this historical thing, is how much material was actually eroded off of the landscape historically due to roads. All these roads around here, every single one of them, well, not all of them, but most of them have been here for 300 years, and for most of their time, they had no pavement on them. They were just dirt wagon tracks. And this is a view of one, a hillshade from the LiDAR. And right in here, if you zoom in and look at the LiDAR, you can see that there's 3 meters of erosion of material that has been excavated. Well, I guess this side is 2.5, and this side is about 3. We're beginning to explore how we can basically automatically calculate the volumes of sediment that have been eroded out of these landscapes. And we know, by the way, that this wasn't done on purpose. There are humongous trees growing out of the banks of the stuff. They've been there for a long time before machinery. And if you look at the bottom of the valley, this all got eroded, but there's not, there's no ramp here. This material is all gone. There's almost never any super elevation of any significance in the lowlands. It's always cut out of the hill, and in fact, it always makes the hill steeper because the maximum cutting is actually at the bottom of the hill where the water velocities would be the greatest, and the top of the hill is almost never eroded. So these are definitely not purposeful features of our road surfaces. Okay, I got to wrap up here. This is our last kind of integrative objective, and I guess I'll just say quickly that we believe that by kind of combining a mass balance of sediments and specifically of surface area, and combining that with kind of end-member signatures of how much organic carbon is associated with that surface area at all of its sources and all of its sinks, we can do basically a volume-weighted or a mass-weighted summation to calculate what the net carbon storage is due to the erosion process, a process of moving minerals from the hill to a depocenter. We've done some other modeling, some top modeling, and we're getting into the Penn State Integrated Hydrological Model. We're doing quite a bit of that and some other work, but I'll just skip ahead of that. So I have a minute or two for questions. Sorry about going long. Thank you.
Hey, sorry, I had to unmute myself. No, that was an excellent talk. Thank you. It's a remarkable achievement, all the different pieces you've put together. If you'd like to submit a question, you could either ask directly to the speaker or type something into the chat box, or at the top of the page there's a raise your hand tool. But while people are, well, let's first ask if there's anything from the audience. If not, if you don't mind, I could ask. I mean, down here in Georgia, we have many of the same Piedmont erosional issues. One of the things here were the reservoirs that have, in the last 50 years, captured a lot of those channel sediments. Are there comparable reservoirs in your system?
Human-made reservoirs, basically impoundments.
Yes.
This area had quite a number of mill dams associated with it. And in fact, a paper published in Science, I think in 2007 or 2008 by Walter and Merritt's described for just down the road from us, Lancaster County, just 20, 40 miles away, they're finding that essentially river valleys have been completely filled by post-colonial sediment. And I think that finding really got people all over the world thinking, geomorphologists really thinking about the fact that, wow, there is a human, what we thought of as the floodplain is really a human feature. It probably looked quite a bit different. They go on to kind of talk about the role of mill dams and mill ponds, and they make the assertion that most of these finds, sediments that are in our valleys were deposited in mill ponds behind dams. I think that there are certainly some examples of that, but I think they might be overstating that as a predominant mechanism. In our watersheds, most of the mill ponds were most of the mill dams were tiny little dams that diverted water into a mill race, and that the mill dam itself had almost no pond behind it. Nevertheless, our floodplains, I would agree, and we have abundant evidence for, are filled with sediments that's been deposited here in the last 300 years since humans denuded this landscape. So there's a big historical signature here, human signature.
Well, in terms of the organo-mineral complexes, would you expect there to be significant deposition then in these areas? Have you examined that?
Yes, right. So we're looking very much at that. And one of the slides I showed, actually, maybe I can go back to it, showed what the typical sequence is. I'll find it here in a moment. Maybe it's further down here. Oh, yeah, I'll get there. So so the short story is, not quite. Here we go. How about this one? There we go. All right. So this is a typical bank down here, and you see this there's a gravel layer that's basically underwater, and then right above it, it's really dark. And we're following Merritt and Walter's convention of really considering that a pre-colonial wetland. It's really obviously dark. There's leaves in it. You can yank sticks out of it. radiocarbon dating shows that it's 300 to 3,000 years old, and everything above it, I think, is post-colonial. So all of that material that's deposited afterwards is completely loaded with carbon. It does not look like a B horizon at all, even though it's a meter deep. If you go in the uplands, the B horizons have almost no carbon in them. Even in an ag field or forest, there's no carbon once you get down below 20 centimeters. And yet in the floodplains, they're completely loaded with carbon all the way down.
So that's essentially a critical zone in your system. That's the more active. I mean, in the forested areas, you mentioned the ag and the B horizon. In the forested areas, would you see much organomineral complexation?
No. Well, it's there right at the A horizon, but it's really in the forested area. It's limited by mixing. And let's see. Did I have a soil profile? I guess I didn't. Not with carbon, but essentially. The carbon is just doesn't really get down very deep in a natural soil, even less in a forest than in an ag. The forest has a lot of carbon right near the surface. Ag has a lot less. But actually, once you get down to 20 centimeters, ag soils often have more carbon than a forest soil because it's been mixed. The carbon has actually been mixed down deeper. Forest soils don't have any carbon down deep. But floodplains are all of them, from Bolivia to Pennsylvania. Every floodplain I've ever looked at is loaded with carbon.
Well, one question I had, too, is on your community science is providing a platform to the scientific community for providing platforms for taking measurements. What do you think would be an effective way to get more universities or scientists involved at some of these CZO sites? Do you think there's a process for enabling maybe a recommendation to NSF or something? Have you thought about maybe how to make it more easier for folks to come in and work?
Well, I think most of the CZO investigators have open arms to having collaborations. Of course, collaboration can only go so far without funding. We have one proposal that was funded to work specifically with our CZO. It had been submitted, I should say not we at all. Francois Morel at Princeton and Krappel had been looking to study basically the role of molybdenum in nitrogen fixation and vanadium. And they had gotten dinged twice. It was because they didn't really know enough background about their site. And it was suggested to them that they write their third round and probably their last round to specifically work at a CZO site. So they did that. They got a letter of support from us and from the Shale Hills CZO, and they got funded. And now they're working with us completely independent. I mean, they're giving us a tiny little bit of money to help them with logistics and stuff, but essentially they got funded because they decided to hitch their wagon to a CZO. But they're getting 95% of the money in that grant. The folks at Rutgers University, a bunch of geophysicists, they have got a strong program there, saw some opportunities to work with us. They pulled together a class and came down here. I mentioned this earlier with the class project. That data that they collect with all those students, they want to develop into a proposal to basically work at our CZO. The benefit to them is that we're collecting all this hydrological data that directly benefits them. So they don't have to worry about that. And the benefit to Francois Morel was that we're collecting all the soil chemistry data. He doesn't have to worry about that. We're characterizing the soils, describing them extensively. So there are already benefits that I think are there. That said, NSF is thinking about this issue, and right now they're preparing the next solicitation for the next round of funding for the CZOs. As many of you know, the first 3 CZOs are running out of money right now, but they're about to get a 1-year extension. The second round of funded CZOs, which includes our CZO, have actually been asked to accelerate our spending so that we end basically at the end of next fiscal year. So there will be a new CZO solicitation that comes out in the next 6 months, and this is actually kind of hot off the news press. I don't know what that solicitation is going to look like, but I've been told that it will have money for more than just the existing CZOs, one way or another. It will have money to grease the wheels for other people to come and work at CZOs, for potentially new CZOs to occur, to be built. So NSF wants to have that happen.
Well, that sounds really exciting.
It is.
Any other questions here before we wrap up? Well, thank you so much, Anthony, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
And thanks for me too, Anthony. Thanks for doing it.
Great.
All right. Have a good time, everybody. This is the final cyber seminar of the spring season, so we will see you next fall, and check online. All of the recordings will be up here shortly. Thank you.
And thank you all for attending this afternoon.